In the last video, we talked about the causes of the war and a little bit about some of the fighting, but in the immediate cause is when Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, because that's finally when the Western democracies of France and Great Britain say that is enough and they need to step in and stop Germany. So Hitler is going to form an alliance, as we said, with Japan and Italy, known as the Axis powers, and decides to invade Poland. He wanted to unify all Germans and take that word, again, we said, for living space for Germans, for German people to the east. At first, we talked about yesterday, and you read about this in the Stalin packet, if you got to that so far, that he agreed to split Poland with the Soviet Union. So when he invades Poland from the west, Stalin invades from the east, and they divide up Poland. So to start the war, Russia and with Stalin and Germany under Hitler are on the same side. Stalin was surprised Hitler was willing to work with him because he was a communist, but was happy to sign that non-aggression pact we talked about, basically saying they agreed not to attack each other and a joint invasion and split up of Polish land. In September of 1939, Hitler invaded and quickly conquered Poland with the USSR, but was surprised when Britain and France declared war. The reason he was surprised when they declared war is because for so long they were just saying, hey, don't do anything else, don't do anything else. And finally, the invasion of Poland was enough for them to declare war. Fighting Britain and France after the fighting started, were overwhelmed very quickly by the blitzkrieg that we talked about. That means lightning warfare with the airplanes, tanks, and then infantry. And within 1 year, Germany is going to conquer France. So it's like the Franco-Prussian War all over again. So early access success. Remember, these are the bad guys here, and I have no problem saying bad guys and good guys during World War II. So Germany was easily able to overwhelm the British forces since it had superior weapons. It was very industrialized strategy, and it practiced using them, remember, in that Spanish Civil War. Within a year, Hitler defeated all of his opponents in Western Europe, leaving only England, who the only reason Great Britain survived was because they had the English Channel protecting them, and Hitler was afraid to launch a sea invasion of it. Britain had a very strong navy. With the West secured, Hitler continued for the race struggle and wanted Germans to have enough living space. So he invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa. So he breaks the non-aggression pact with Russia, and this is Hitler's mistake. If he would have stayed allied with Russia, maybe they would be able to win the war against England and eventually the United States. However, invading Russia, just like Napoleon did years earlier, is going to be detrimental. Also unprepared to fight the Blitzkrieg, the Soviets are going to get knocked back very quickly. They were unprepared for war since they had a non-aggression pact with them. However, they're finally going to be able to dig in when the Germans are stopped by winter, the same way Napoleon was stopped by winter when he tried it in 1814. Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow are going to be able to be like defenses, and they're finally going to be able to start battling Germany back from those cities. So while the Soviets had heavy losses, they would eventually push Germans back, again, starting at Stalingrad. Hitler by 1942 had pretty much conquered all of Europe that you can see here. So all of the red that you see here is territory that was completely conquered or allied with Germany. And you can see, all the way over to Great Britain. He was all the way over to Great Britain. The English Channel protected them, and you see he's going to be able to stop them around Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. In December of 1941, with France and conquered and Britain at war, Japan is going to take that to seize all Western outposts in East Asia. So they're going to start conquering all of these territories. Remember, Japan started to industrialize during the Meiji Restoration, and Japan does not have a lot of natural resources. So it's very important for them to go out and conquer territory, especially in China, in order to be able to fuel their industrialization. In an attempt to ensure the U.S. cannot stop its conquest, it is going to have the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. I'm sure we've all heard of Pearl Harbor before, when the Japanese surprise attack by airplanes and blow up a lot of ships, kill a few thousand people, and it's going to be what brings the United States into war. Midway is the important battle between the United States and Japan in 1942, where the United States is going to be able to sink a lot of Japanese aircraft carriers, and after that, Japan is going to be on the retreat, and the United States is going to do what's called island hopping, going from small island to small island to small island, clearing out any Japanese resistance. But Japanese were, very prideful, fought till the last men, and because of that, a lot of casualties from both sides mount during this part of the war. We've already talked about these a little bit, but some of Hitler's policies within Germany and also the states he conquered during this, the Nuremberg laws were those anti-Semitic laws. We said you can't get married to someone who's non-Jewish. If you are, he encouraged Germans to boycott Jewish businesses. All Jews had to wear the Star of David to identify themselves. Eventually, they seized their bank assets, their property, move them into ghettos where eventually it's called the final solution, is the thought to try to exterminate the Jews out of Germany and out of Europe, in concentration camps. Now, we've talked about how the SS are Hitler's secret police. He had this youth program that young boys would have to take, full of Hitler's propaganda and basically a brainwash program to train boys into loyal German soldiers. And of course, just like all totalitarian leaders, going to use propaganda to scapegoat the Jewish population and other people of the population in order to get support for his effort. Again, Pearl Harbor, we said Japan attacks a Hawaiian naval base that brings the United States into war, kills thousands, sinks many important ships, but the U.S. is able to, rebuild, repair, and eventually we'll talk about how they get their revenge on Japan. During the war, as it starts to get towards the end and Japan is running out of resources, they're getting defeated, they go to a strategy called kamikaze, which translates to divine winds. And it's basically suicide pilots that would load their planes up with explosives and try to crash into as many ships or people as they could, basically a suicide bomber to try and inflict as much damage as possible. In Europe, the tide of the war is going to change with D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. It's going to be a massive land invasion by sea on the beaches of Normandy, of France. So you might be saying, why would the Allies invade France? Well, Britain, the United States, Canada, and other allies needed to land somewhere in mainland Europe because Hitler had conquered it all. So they started with France to try and overthrow the Vichy government and kick the Germans out of France. Many American, British, and other Allied soldiers are going to die, but are eventually victorious and forcing the Germans back, and they begin their slow cross across France, eventually pushing in to Germany. The last offensive for the Germans is going to be the Battle of Bulge in December 1944. The Allied forces were able to stop kind of this last hurrah of German offensive. The Battle of Stalingrad is the same thing, except now on the Eastern Front with Russia. So the Germans' attack on Russia is going to be stopped by the Soviets and eventually pushed back. But remember, in every single one of these battles with artillery shells, the weather of winter, supply lines cut short, it's not only going to lead to a lot of deaths by the actual warfare and fighting, but also disease and the cold and hypothermia and things of that as well. So as the walls are kind of closing in on Hitler from both sides, because you have the Allied powers pushing in from the west of the United States and England, and you have Russia pushing in from the east, Adolf Hitler is going to commit suicide with his recently married bride, Eva Braun, on 4/30/1945. After he commits suicide, Germany surrenders, and basically the Allied forces, led by the United States, have to just focus on Japan, who refuses to surrender. The end of the war completely comes after Japan finally surrenders after the United States drops 2 atomic or nuclear bombs on their cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in August of 1945. Together, they're going to kill, this number is probably a little low, probably over 150,000 people in just a few minutes. But nuclear bombs, radiation, not the people that it doesn't kill, it's going to maim very severely. Radiation effects, even today, there's high levels of cancer and miscarriage and things like that in these areas where there is high levels of radiation. These are the only 2 atomic bombs to ever be dropped on like a military, honestly, not even a military target. It's important that as Americans, we realize that most of the time, like I said, I have no problem calling, the Allied powers the good guys in World War II. However, they're going to drop bombs on 2 major civilian cities to get Japan to surrender the war. And you have to ask yourself, and I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. You have to make that decision for yourself. But is dropping a bomb on civilians in order to win the war an okay part of warfare? The reason that the United States said it was is because they said it would have taken them over 1 million more American deaths in order to actually send troops to each of the islands and into Japan because of how strong the resistance fighting was. And here you see some images of the mushroom cloud of the bomb being dropped and some of the destruction on the ground. VJ Day is Victory over Japan Day, September 2nd, 1945. It comes to an end when fighting in Japan finally ends. Italy surrenders, and Mussolini is overthrown. Hitler then commits suicide. Germany surrenders, and then Japan surrenders after the United States goes through and drops the atomic bombs. And you have that famous kiss, which is weird because those two people don't even know each other in the story. Like, I saw something a few years ago that like they didn't really even stay in touch after that, and she was completely caught off guard, and that it was actually kind of weird. So the Yalta Conference is the conference after World War II, where the U.S., Great Britain, and Russia get together to talk about how to end the war and divide up German territories. Most importantly, this is going to create the United Nations, which still exists today. Should be an S on that. A peacekeeping organization where countries can get together and talk through diplomacy rather than fight things over war. And hopefully, this is ringing, in your head. What is the United Nations similar to? The League of Nations that was created after World War I. However, the United Nations is much stronger, especially because the United States joins this time, and it's still around today. Also, because of the Holocaust, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, in 1948, Israel becomes a Jewish nation. There's constant fighting still, even to this day, between Muslims and Jews who live there in the Gaza Strip. Remember, the Zionism or Zionist movement was the thought for Jewish homeland. So in 1948, after World War II, after the Jewish population goes through so much, especially in Europe, they are granted their own nation, and Israel is still a country here today in 2021. And you can see where Israel is located right here in red in the Middle East. The Nuremberg trials are important to know. Basically, it's the trials held after World War II to punish Nazi war criminals, to punish especially the leaders of the Holocaust and prevent future acts of genocide, which is the mass killing of a group of people. A lot of them are going to be found guilty. It's basically looks at the top of the SS soldiers that worked in concentration camps. A lot of them are sentenced to death. A lot of them commit suicide in jail. Some are let go, and some, end up spending, anywhere from a few years to life in prison, depending on the severity of their crimes. So this leads us to actually talking about the Holocaust. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit more in person after break. But I remember if you remember talking about social Darwinism, this eugenics program, like how to improve the human species, took a dark turn when a lot of Nazi scientists and governments began to issue forced sterilizations, basically taking people they saw as unfit and sterilizing them from having kids so they wouldn't, reproduce, leading to what they would see as a stronger human race. In order to fulfill the pro-German worldwide view, Nazis felt like they had to get rid of things they saw as illnesses, which included, people that were Jewish, criminals, people that were mentally or physically handicapped, gypsies, the LGBT community, TQ community, and many, many others. So anyone they saw as inferior to themselves, which is pretty much, honestly, anyone that wasn't a pure German blood. As a result, as we said, the Nazi governments began to sterilize these groups, posing the moral question, does anyone have the right to deny others reproduction? And I think that answer was pretty clear. The Nazis did not begin their quest of extermination until 3 years into the war. They started with less violent methods, but still terrible. Initially, Nazi Germany encouraged non-Germans to leave, specifically Jews, and often established, I can't speak, territories that prosecuted these people, like the Nuremberg laws. They also condoned events, a night called Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, which encouraged, non-Germans to leave because they go and smash all of their businesses and graffiti and steal and burn down synagogues. It's referred to as the Night of Broken Glass or Kristallnacht. To promote the German race, the Nazis began fertilization programs and literally gave awards to mothers who had large amount of children because they wanted to grow this strong German population. They set up these same policies in basically all of the places that they took over as well. Um, for the Holocaust, it started with trying to relocate Jews and other people they saw as inferior groups. This was once the war was underway. They started to get more aggressive with it. This was known as the final solution. So in 1942, the Germans became more desperate to get rid of these groups of people, and the final solution was death. Like, we have to get rid of these people at the Wannsee Conference, is where that came up with. At this point, all Jews anywhere in Europe that were under Nazi control were shipped to extermination camps such as Auschwitz in Poland. But there was literally hundreds and hundreds of these concentration camps, some big, some small, where able men were worked to death and a lot of other, killed on arrival. It would be impossible to accurately describe how terrible the living, working, and death that these people, by the millions, had to suffer. Um, because of their ethnicity, because of their beliefs, because they were seen by another, scapegoated by another group, and he was able to convince them that they were inferior, which is clearly not true. I'm going to ask that you go through, and the rest of these PowerPoints are like the rest of this PowerPoint. You'll see it's not very long. It's like 4 more slides. Is down below to finish these notes. We will recap World War II and the Holocaust when you get back from break. If you're an online student, please make sure you submit this. And if you have the note packet, please make sure you finish it, by the end of today. We'll review World War II when we get back, and then start the last topic of the Cold War before we spend the last 2 weeks before the exam reviewing. I hope you have a wonderful break. Goodbye.